During the Clone Wars, the Confederacy of Independent Systems essentially became a puppet government for the corporate powers on the Separatist Council, as most fans know full well. These included some of the nastiest and most unscrupulous corporations in the galaxy, including the Banking Clan, the Trade Federation, and of course Commerce Guild. After the Clone Wars ended, these corporations were all nationalized and liquidated by the Empire. But what happened to the corporations that supported the Republic? Were there any separatist megacorps that switched sides during the war? If so, how did the Empire treat them? In this video, we'll be answering all these questions.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Megacorporations had been powerful in the Republic since its formation, and by the time of the Clone Wars, they had a long track record of exploiting and destroying entire planets for the sake of profit. The Galactic Senate spent millennia struggling to find a way to crack down on corporate misdeeds, particularly one that the lobbyists who controlled most senators would approve of. The most common solution, of course, was to talk a whole lot about the issue and then do nothing. But now and again, over the course of centuries, the Republic would actually do something about the megacorps. Naturally, with the Senate being the corrupt mess it was, when the Republic took action, it usually just meant giving the corporations places to do whatever the heck they wanted in the hopes they'd leave everyone else alone. One of the most notorious of such experiments happened about 500 years before the Clone Wars. At the time, the Republic was struggling to kickstart colonization efforts in the Rim, and several opportunistic megacorps claimed they could do better than the government if incentivized. The Senate apparently believed them and gave these corporations total control of a region called the Outer Expansion Zone, a thinly settled slice of space. It didn't take long for this experiment to end in disaster. Not long after the zone was ceded to the corporation, reports came pouring out of the region about ruthless practices and rights violations that would give even the Sith cause for concern. The Republic promptly rescinded its deal with the corporations and ended the experiment. However, there remained quite a few corporations that loved the idea of having a whole swath of space to rule, and there were always plenty of senators open to bribes from these corporations. Thus, just a generation later, the Republic tried the same thing again, except this time, they ceded one of the most remote sectors of the galaxy and sent a full subsector's worth of warships to protect the rights of workers in the region. This swath of space contained just a few hundred systems this time, all uninhabited, and it was fittingly named the Corporate Sector. The Corporate Sector lasted much longer than the Outer Expansion Zone had, but it wasn't really what the corporations had imagined for a second attempt at corporate fiefdom. The Republic didn't regulate commerce in the sector, but the small size of the region and its remoteness meant that business wasn't all that worthwhile anyway. Repeatedly, the corporations lobbied for permission to expand their territory, but the Republic routinely denied their request. As a result, the corporate sector came to dislike the Republic, and when the Confederacy of Independent Systems declared itself, the sector seceded and joined them. So now that we've got a bit of background, let's get back to some of the questions we asked at the start of the video. A large number of megacorporations joined the Separatists during the Clone Wars, but there were also many that backed the Republic. The Taggy Company, Republic CNR Systems, and Cybot Galactica were just a few of the powerful corporate powers that opposed the Confederacy, even while many of their competitors were jumping ship. Some of these corporations even went so far as to break ties with corporate partners or parent companies over their secession. Taggy Co., for example, severed all of its ties with the Trade Federation shortly before the Clone Wars, while Kuat Drive Yards left the Techno Union to become the primary supplier for the Republic Navy. Some companies jumped ship during the Clone Wars as well, especially as the tide turned in the Republic's favor. Many of these Loyalist corporations had a major stake in the corporate sector, as you might expect. When the Clone Wars began, however, the Separatist megacorporations forced the Loyalist ones out of their corporate sector holdings. Of course, that loss was only temporary. The Republic turned Empire reconquered the corporate sector at the end of the Clone Wars, and the corporations that had supported it quickly swept back in to reclaim their former holdings, and then some. As we mentioned earlier, corporations that had supported the Confederacy during the Clone Wars faced dire consequences during the early days of Imperial rule. The corporate powers of the Separatist Council were all nationalized and liquidated by the Empire, with the exception of the intergalactic banking clan, while many smaller corporations faced similar fates. But the Empire wasn't anti-corporate. In fact, it generally supported corporations so long as they weren't an obstacle to the Imperial agenda. The Empire even rewarded the corporations that strongly supported it. On the suggestion of Baron Orman Taggi, the head of Taggi Co., the corporations that had supported the Republic during the Clone Wars were rewarded with control of the corporate sector. They were given all of the combined assets that the Separatist megacorporations controlled there to divide amongst themselves, and more besides. In the early days of the Empire, the corporate sector was expanded from a few hundred systems to a sizable swath of space containing over 30,000 potentially habitable worlds. The corporations there were allowed to operate with virtually zero Imperial oversight, and were even allowed to form their own quasi-government, the Corporate Sector Authority. The corporate sector was located at the northern end of the Hydean Way, far removed from most of galactic civilization, rimward even of the Sith worlds. Its capital was the planet Etai 4, the headquarters of Cybot Galactica, while its most populous world was Bonadan, a cesspit of a spaceport at the very end of the Hydean Way. It was in the middle of what was normally considered outlaw territory, but the Corporate Sector Authority maintained a substantial private military to keep the pirates and slavers out. To many suffering under the rule of the new Galactic Empire, the corporate sector seemed like a remote bastion of freedom, or at least that was how the CSA promoted it. However, to those who immigrated to the sector, including a good many non-humans fleeing Imperial persecution, they found it to be anything but. In the corporate sector, all the usual tropes of cyberpunk dystopias were just facts of life, from endless intrusive advertisements to ruthless workplace competition. Workers in the employ of the CSA's signatory companies were trapped in a world where their bosses owned literally everything around them, from the ground they walked on to the air they breathed. Many fled an empire that treated them as second class, just to end up in a nightmarish corporatocracy that treated them as consumers and nothing more. Officially, despite the presence of over 30,000 habitable worlds in the corporate sector, the whole region was completely devoid of indigenous sentient life. Scientists on the payroll of the Corporate Sector Authority speculated this was due to a number of unique solar anomalies that weren't found anywhere else in the galaxy. Unofficially, the CSA covered up the very existence of 11 sentient species that they found and enslaved upon taking control of the sector. Dozens more were rumored to have been quietly exterminated by the CSA upon discovery. You would think the one benefit to life in the corporate sector would be freedom from the tyrannical Imperial police state, but clearly the people in that part of space just couldn't have nice things. The CSA's security police, or SBOS, were every bit as nasty as stormtroopers, even if they didn't have nearly as frightening of a reputation. They regularly tortured suspects and even killed them outright if it was convenient, knowing the CSA likely wouldn't do anything about it. Known for ignoring actual crimes so long as profits were up, and their endless surveillance and harassment of debtors to corporate sector companies, the SBOS were the finishing touch that made the corporate sector a perfect dystopia. We all know that the megacorporations that supported the CIS were evil to the core, and that they had a long track record of ruthless exploitation. Ironically, however, the corporations that supported the Republic ended up being worse than the Separatists, much like the Republic turned Empire itself. The corporations given control of the corporate sector were supposedly the good guys, those who had been on the right side of the Clone Wars. Yet, the corporate sector ended up being every bit as bad as the Empire, and to make all this even worse, it actually got away with it. The New Republic did nothing to punish the corporate sector for its crimes, even though it recognized the injustices the sector perpetuated. So, that's our look at the corporate sector and its rather grim story. But what do you think? Would you like to hear more stories like this one? Let us know all your thoughts and more in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next video.